Hello, the following lecture is about the illness of the world-famous Czech music composer Bedřich Smetana. Since his diagnosis is still the subject of passionate debate after 140 years, it is more than appropriate to recall without emotion the main facts and findings both from preserved sources, including the autopsy report, and from the exhumation which was carried out 100 years after the composer's death. I would call the lecture The Admirable Demythization of Musical Genius. I wish you a pleasant experience. Bedřich Smetana undoubtedly belonged to our most important composers. Along with Antonín Dvořák and Leoš Janáček, he is now the most famous Czech composer worldwide and is considered the founder of Czech national music. He was born as the son of a well-off brewer. On the left, you can see the brewery in Litomyšl then and now. It's in the courtyard right next to the castle and you can visit any time. In the picture here are his father, František Smetana, and his wife Barbora Nelinková. These are portraits by Antonín Makek from around the time when little Bedřich was about 8 years old. Antonín Makek was a Czech painter of the Classicism and Biedermeier periods, especially known as a portraitist and painter of historical genres. These portraits show the social standing of the middle class at that time. If you imagine what a portrait of a brewery master would look like today, he'd probably be in a stretched-out t-shirt and jeans. The fact that they had themselves portrayed like nobles back then speaks to something, that the environment into which Bedřich Smetana was born was, in its own way, stimulating. Even though he came from a family of 18 children, František Smetana had 8 children from 2 previous marriages, 5 of whom survived, and 10 children with Barbara Linková, 7 of whom reached adulthood. Bedřich was their 3rd child, but the first son. When we consider where the genes for such an enormous talent like Bedřich Smetana's came from, aside from the fact that his father František was a passionate amateur musician, Barbara Linková was reportedly related to or part of the family of Jiří Ignác Linka, a Czech composer. This is what the house named after Bedřich Smetana looks like today in Litomyšl. The young Bedřich Smetana moved many times across Bohemia because he was not a particularly talented student, and his parents moved to try and find a different school where he might do better. But mainly his father was such a successful brewery master that he received offers to establish breweries around Bohemia, including in Jindřichův Hradec and elsewhere, so they moved to several places within the Czech lands. In the end, Bedřich managed to complete his secondary education at a grammar school in Plzeň. Afterward, he worked as a music teacher, pianist, choir master, and conductor until he became deaf in 1874. For financial reasons, he spent several years in Gothenburg, Sweden, from 1856 to 1862. This is his house in Gothenburg, which is now a wig-making shop. When Smetana became deaf in 1874, he gave up his career as a conductor and opera director and withdrew from public life. In 1849, he married Kateřina Kolářová, who bore him 4 children, 3 of whom died in early childhood, including his beloved firstborn Bedřiška. The memory of her appears in the final movement of his piano trio in G minor with the citation of a funeral march. Kateřina Kolářová died of tuberculosis while traveling from Gothenburg to Dresden. You can imagine how much of an ordeal and complication that was for Smetana. However, just a year later, Smetana married Bettina Ferdinandiová, with whom he had 2 daughters. She outlived him. The marriage wasn't particularly consummated and turned into more of a practical arrangement. Smetana composed throughout his entire life. His works include 8 operas, including The Bartered Bride, 14 choral works, songs, 3 symphonic compositions, among them My Country, and 15 other compositions, 2 string quartets, both of them unique, 1 piano trio, also unique, 1 violin duo, or rather 2, and many piano compositions. Let's not forget that Smetana was an extraordinary piano virtuoso, often referred to as the Czech Liszt. His piano works include dances, etudes, preludes, dreams, and many others that experts know well, and you'll have the opportunity to hear one during this lecture. However, the general public doesn't know Smetana's piano work well because it is very challenging and therefore rarely performed. Yet there are hidden treasures within his piano compositions. In 1875, a year after becoming deaf, Smetana moved with his family to the village of Žabkanice, north of Prague, where the husband of his daughter, Zsófi, was the head forester. He was quite well off, so he could take care of all of Smetana's needs. He set up a studio for him there. Interestingly, his name was Josef Schwarz, who had a descendant, Zdeněk Schwarz, who became the head of the emergency medical services in Prague, directly descended from Bedřich Smetana. And his daughter, Zsófi, was an excellent draftswoman. The colored drawing of Žabkanice from that time seen on the right was made by Smetana's daughter, Zsófi. Her talent was possibly inherited from Bedřich Smetana, who, besides being a brilliant composer with extraordinary auditory imagination, writing his greatest works without hearing a single note, was also a skilled artist. This is a drawing by Bedřich Smetana, titled With a Dog on the Partridges in Summer, and it's quite a decent piece of work. Here is another drawing by Smetana. At first I thought these were the islands on the Vltava River, but they're not. It's some imaginary hobbit-like landscape that I haven't identified, looking somewhat like science fiction. Here you see his daughter Zsófi and the forester Schwarz. Whenever you see a beautiful woman with, let's say, a less attractive man, you know he must be wealthy. Even though Smetana received a pension, he was desperately poor. This is his studio in Žabkanice on the right. Like Beethoven, even after his complete and unfortunate loss of hearing, Smetana retained his auditory imagination and ability to compose without any loss of quality. You can't detect any decline in his work. Now regarding his illness. Let's unravel the mystery called the diagnosis of Bedřich Smetana, which is still a topic of debate today. There is no data on mental disorders among Smetana's relatives, except for his daughter from his second marriage, Božena, who went down in history as Beatrix. She died in 1941 at the age of 78 in a psychiatric hospital in Vienna, Am Steinhof. Her symptoms resembled the terminal condition of Bedřich Smetana, and she was diagnosed with senile brain atrophy with cerebral sclerosis. This was an argument for the non-specific origin of Smetana's illness. However, the hereditary nature of both conditions isn't convincing enough to rule out a syphilitic origin of his illness. As for his personal medical history, Smetana was severely myopic, short-sighted, had a seborrheic condition, suffered from pyoderma and boils. At the age of 11, he sustained facial injuries caused by the explosion of a bottle of gunpowder. Unfortunately, he treated the wound with pond water, fearing punishment for playing with gunpowder. This led to an infection, which complicated the healing process. He developed osteomyelitis in his right temporal bone and mandible, resulting in facial asymmetry, which he concealed with varying beard lengths. He frequently suffered from periodontitis and toothaches, which plagued him throughout his life. Here you can see the overlay of his portrait with his skull. This is the X-ray of his skull, and here is the actual skull. You can see how the bone reinforcement on the right side of his jaw was smaller than on the left, which he hid with longer facial hair. Even though the photograph is slightly tilted, it's still noticeable. Smetana had a mild, tolerant, and conciliatory nature, with a high tolerance for frustration and resilience. He developed strong resilience over time. During a span of 10 years, he lost 3 children and his wife. Yet he built a solid resistance to both personal and professional adversity, including sharp confrontations with conductor Jan Nepomuk Mayer, choir master and critic Pivoda, and others. This is the conductor Jan Nepomuk Mayer, who disliked Smetana. The first warning clinical signs appeared in 1862, when Smetana was 38 years old. He heard a duet of male voices and the sound of an organ amidst the noise of a train. This can be classified as pseudo-hallucinations because he recognized them as such. True hallucinations would mean he believed the male voices and organ sounds were real, but he interpreted them as hallucinations, hence pseudo-hallucinations. From that time onward, the tinnitus in his ears increased and he had growing hearing difficulties. This culminated in April 1874. He reported a long-term treatment of a persistent boil somewhere on his body, though no one knows exactly where. In May 1874, he had a lasting sore throat. In June and July, the tinnitus worsened, and between September and October 1874, he went completely deaf. very suddenly to the point that he could no longer hear anything at all. This mobilized various doctors, as Smetana was already a well-known composer. Doctors started examining him, including Dr. Trölch in Würzburg and Politzer in Vienna, both of whom were ENT specialists. They diagnosed paralysis of the auditory nerves with central involvement and neuritis, recommending electrification and perforation of the eardrums, so they electrically stimulated his auditory nerves and punctured his eardrum. Dr. Zaufal in Prague introduced the Schmierko treatment, which is suspicious because it involved a mercury ointment used to treat syphilis. Dr. Politzer probably suspected syphilis as the cause. Syphilis, as a possible cause of deafness, had only been recognized a few years earlier, so it wasn't as obvious back then as it might seem to us today. The Schmierko was prescribed to Smetana, and additionally his head was wrapped in cotton, and the mercury ointment was rubbed into his skin for more than a month, if not much longer. As a result, Smetana was also suffering from mercury poisoning. Imagine this poor man who goes deaf, has his eardrum punctured, and then on top of that his head is wrapped in cotton and his body covered with mercury ointment, while he's left to sit in this condition. As a side note, since the 16th century, treatments for syphilis mainly involved mercury, both metallic mercury and unguentum cinereum, grey ointment, where the body would absorb up to 10 grams of mercury daily, vermilion, mercury sulfide, cinnabar, inhaling mercury vapors, swallowing sublimates, mercuric chloride, or calomel, mercurous chloride. There was also Liquor mercurialis sweeteniae, or sweetens drops, a mix of brandy with sublimate. Logically, then iodine was introduced. Iodine protect and preserve our Kaiser, our land. And medicinal guaiac, Guaiacum officinale, also known as holy wood. Here is what it looked like. Smetana's homemade mouthwash was actually an ethanol solution with an extract of guaiac wood, as if he knew what was ailing him. He also showed symptoms of mercury intoxication, such as agitation, erethism, depression, tremors, dysarthria, Parkinsonian symptoms, and choreatic movements. The debate over Bedřich Smetana's diagnosis was a matter of arguments between skeptics, more realistic experts, mainly Germans, who with a grain of salt may have somewhat wished syphilis upon Smetana, and Czech patriots who were blinded by their love for Smetana and vehemently denied syphilis, each side presenting their arguments. This debate is reminiscent of Andrei Zid's return from the USSR, where he wrote that one can either lovingly lie about the Soviet Union or tell the truth with hatred. That's more or less how it was with Bedřich Smetana, though not as dramatic. The Germans claimed that the furuncle was actually a primary chancre, but this was never confirmed. Therefore, the Czechs insisted it was just a furuncle. Later, the sore throat was argued to be a specific form of tonsillitis, while others said it was a non-specific streptococcal infection. The Germans claimed that his deafness was caused by a specific inflammation of the auditory nerves, leading to their atrophy. The Czechs countered, saying the deafness was due to arteriosclerosis or atrophy of the auditory nerves. It's true that there are no reliable data on a primary syphilitic infection, although another of Smetana's enemies, František Pivoda, suspected that opera singer Lela Ricci, who may have had congenital syphilis, had some sort of relationship with Smetana, while the Czechs maintain that there are no reliable records of a primary infection, of course, because they attribute everything to the injury from the exploding gunpowder bottle in his childhood, which led to subsequent arteriosclerosis and so on. But that argument is absurd. Smetana suffered the jaw and temporal bone injury from the explosion when he was 10 or 11 years old, but he went deaf at age 50. What was that deafness doing for the 40 years in between? It's a complete mystery, so we can rule that out. Smetana wrote neatly, though with various grammatical mistakes, because although Czech was his beloved language, it wasn't his primary one. That was German. Here, you can see how, even 2 years before his death, when he was already in poor health, he still wrote neatly to someone. What touched me was his letter to the director of the National Theatre, which was to be reopened after it burned down, with Smetana's Libouche set to be performed at the reopening. On that occasion, he wrote to the director František Schubert, "I've left the mistakes in intentionally." Most honorable and highly esteemed director of the Czech National Theatre in Prague, when I was in Prague this summer, I primarily wanted to thank you personally for granting me an increase of 300 florins to my salary. My meeting with you, noble sir, revealed you to me in all your virtues, so much so that I returned with tears in my eyes. That day we were already negotiating the terms under which I would offer my musical work Libouche for the opening of the new theatre. My respect for you lay in admiration for your nobility. Please forgive me for pointing out a request, which lies more in the theatre's current events now than when I had the honor of knowing your noble spirit. At that time, you presented me with complimentary access to the theatre in the boxes or in the seats of the stalls, etc. I cannot describe the profound emotions I felt for these great gifts. However, I have a small personal request. I would very much like to be present at the first gala performance on November 18th. Tickets cost in 50 and 40 florins as entrance fees are beyond my means. Therefore, I will come on Thursday, November 15th, so I can peacefully participate in the celebration of November 18th. Perhaps I will also stay for the second and maybe even the third performance of Libouche. Maybe there will be some little corner where I could sit without bothering anyone in the theatre, perhaps by a pardon pillar. With the deepest expression of respect, I have the honor to always remain your admirer, Bedřich Smetana, Jablonice, November 11th, 1883. This letter was written just a few months before his death, and it's remarkable that the man who composed the opera for the grand reopening of the National Theatre is pleading for a ticket, asking to sit somewhere behind a pillar where he wouldn't disturb anyone. It's unbelievable. Where is the director of the National Theatre, Schubert, today? And where is Smetana? In the last years of Smetana's life, truly psychotic symptoms began to appear, primarily auditory hallucinations of multiple voices. These are confirmed by available evidence, both from his correspondence and other reports, such as medical records. From 1882, he repeatedly and convincingly described visits from imaginary people in his room, and he had no insight into his psychotic symptoms. He would converse with non-existent people. In letters, he also described what he called transient brain attacks, during which he would lose his ability to speak and could only produce stammering sounds like ne-ne-ne-te-te-te, ta-ta-ta. There's a recorded incident when he rang the bell at his librettist's door, wanting to discuss something about an opera. When she answered, he stood there and could only say ne-ne-ne. She asked, "Oh my God, what's wrong with you, Mr. Smetana?" So he gave up and went home, where his speech suddenly returned to normal. From the beginning of 1883, he suffered from severe memory problems. His speech became paralytically fragmented, and he was often agitated, confused, and distracted, writing incomprehensible notes and letters to imaginary people, especially to Mozart, Beethoven, and others. He suffered from an unrelenting cough. Tabic, this is uncertain. Paralytic dysarthria, unsteady walking, frequent falls, and disorientation. Asking, "Who are you?" "Well, I'm your daughter Jofi." Oh, anyone could say that. He became aggressive, which contrasted sharply with his otherwise gentle nature. He destroyed furniture, objects, his own works, and threatened his close ones with a pistol at close range. He had a gun for self-defense, which can still be seen in the Bedřich Smetana Museum here in the picture. He suffered from disordered actions, mixing Czech and German incoherently. In 1882, he wrote to his teacher Zavadil, "My illness only allows me to work in small intervals. If I write for even an hour, the ringing in my head starts and I get dizzy flashes before my eyes, forcing me to stop everything until it calms down. I struggle to maintain the unity of the entire composition without external distractions, so I can preserve the melodic, harmonic, polyphonic, and orchestral elements in my memory. Nothing foreign, unrelated to the work, should intrude into my mind. Otherwise, the unity of style is lost. My colleagues living in good health and happiness have no idea of the challenges fate has placed upon me while I work." During the last year of his life, he lost control, becoming unpredictably restless and requiring constant 24/7 supervision. It became so unbearable that on April 22nd, 1884, his family doctor sent him to the psychiatric hospital at Kekarlovu 11, where he was taken by Forester Schwartz in a carriage. On May 12, 1884, the suffering composer died after weeks of misery and personal degradation in utterly inhumane conditions. People were afraid to care for him, so they practically slid his food under the door. He wouldn't eat, and they didn't force him, so he began to waste away and deteriorate. Here in this photo, you can see this is the last picture of Bedřich Smetana before his death, obviously taken in a studio. And notice he's wearing a fur coat indoors. This will be relevant soon. Dr. Augustin Guth, in his report for the Prague Asylum for the Insane in Kateřinky, wrote, "The first signs of illness seem to go back to the summer of last year. He complained of occasional auditory and visual hallucinations. He said he clearly heard this or that person speaking in the corner, as if he could see them. Gradually, he lost his memory and couldn't recall words or names. He would scream for hours on end, thinking about Liszt, Wagner, the Emperor, and the Crown Prince. He is unclean, refuses to see water. When being cleaned in the bath, he cries, pleads for help, runs away, doesn't recognize his children or fellow residents. He causes disorder in the house, breaks windows, abstains from eating for 2 or 3 days, then suddenly eats ravenously. He suffers from very advanced confusion." The report is signed in Dobrovic, April 15th, 1884, Dr. Guth, by his own hand. Dr. Walter recorded Smetana's final moments. An old man babbling lay writhing on the couch. His consciousness was completely clouded and he was highly agitated. Though he could no longer stand on his feet in his constant fits of excitement, he gave no rest to himself or his surroundings. He could not be reasoned with, he could not hear. He had to be fed. His speech, already slurred at the onset of paralysis, was now completely unintelligible. He had no lucid moments. In body, the master was all skin and bones. He slowly faded away. Sometimes he laughed with a broken paralytic moan, more like a groan. On May 12th, at 4:30 in the afternoon, he took his last breath. Eugen Venkowski corrected the date of death from May 12th to May 13th based on information from Professor Mysliveček, though this was unjustified. If someone died outside of official hours, bureaucrats would record the date as the following day. The medical record was poor. It lacked essential data about the genius's physical condition, especially the state of the pupils, despite the fact that their characteristic changes in progressive paralysis, loss of pupil response to light while retaining a response to eye convergence, had already been described by the Scottish Dr. Argyll Robertson in 1869. Perhaps this hadn't reached Prague yet. However, it's hard to imagine that no one at the then leading psychiatric institution knew about pupil disorders related to syphilitic brain damage, not just Argyll Robertson's sign, but also extremely narrowed meiotic or non-round pupils. Nonetheless, a study of the fragments of Smetana's medical records suggests that the doctors of the time, Dr. Guth, Dr. Walter, considered progressive paralysis. Ladislav Haškovič also wrote, "Progressive paralysis was well known at our mental asylum in 1884. It has been diagnosed since 1822, 100 years. So here is Bedřich Smetana's autopsy report. As you can see on the right, the examining doctors were Josef Thomayer, after whom the Thomayer Hospital in Karch is named, Dr. Benjamin Čumpelik, a psychiatrist, and Professor Jaroslav Hlava, after whom Hlavův Institute at Albertov is named. He was the chief examiner. The conclusion, illegible, but I deciphered it for you. Leptomeningitis chronica, perencephalitis chronica, hydrocephalus internus chronicus, atrophia cerebri rubra, ependymitis granulosa ventriculi quatri, bilateral pneumonia, thrombosis of the femoral artery, and atrophia universalis. This referred to cachexia. The conclusion was senile dementia. The findings suggested that it could be progressive paralysis, wrote Professor Hlava, but he had to retract this soon after, as passionate debates about the nature of Smetana's illness erupted immediately after his death. This was the dispute between Ladislav Haškovič and Dr. Antonín Heveroch in the pages of the Journal of Czech Physicians and the Review of Neurology and Psychiatry in the 1920s. Even in the 1920s, proponents of the syphilis theory risked being excluded from the Czech Medical Society for unacceptable conclusions, which were considered derogatory and damaging to the reputation and moral integrity of a national hero. And lo and behold, the debate continues to this day. These are experts, Dr. Jiří Ramba and Dr. Otakar Bořík, who continued to promote the theory of the non-specific origin of Smetana's illness, while Dr. Jaroslav Vacek, living in exile, would see red whenever he read these opinions, as he considered anyone who thought Smetana's disease was anything other than syphilitic to be a lunatic. More than 100 years after his death, Bedřich Smetana was exhumed. Here you can see images from the exhumation. Present were Prime Minister Lubomír Strugl here, and this is the organizer of the exhumation, Professor Emanuel Vlček, an anthropologist at the Czech National Museum, where he studied the skulls of Czech kings and similar historical figures, as well as Smetana's remains. The entire exhumation process was rather unfortunate. It rained, the weather was bad, the coffin was rotten, so the bottom fell out, and Smetana's remains spilled into the mud. They had to gather him up, and eventually they managed, as you can see here, to piece the remains back together with difficulty. That's why I had the photo of the skull, because they cleaned and documented it. In the end, Smetana was reassembled. Here on this tray is the cleaned Bedřich Smetana. Behind him, with arms outstretched, is Professor Emanuel Vlček, and on the far right is Professor Straits from forensic medicine. I don't recognize the other gentleman. This is Smetana's malleus dexter hammer bone. Here you can see first how small these auditory ossicles are. The line indicates 1 millimeter. And second, that this hammer bone remained practically undamaged. If you imagine it reduced to its original size of a few millimeters, it would be completely smooth after 100 years of decomposition in the grave. Likewise, the articulatio incudo malearis, here in detail, the line is 100 micrometers, which if reduced to those 100 micrometers would be completely smooth. And this here is the incus on the right. After the entire exhumation process, Smetana could fit into a smaller box. Here they are placing him back into the grave. Among those present were relatives of Bedřich Smetana, of whom there are still quite a few throughout the Czech Republic. Now, at that time, the director of the psychiatric hospital in Prague was a German doctor, Jakub Fischl. The surviving fragments of records are surprisingly poor, and upon Smetana's admission, no one examined for Argyll Robertson's sign. Additionally, Smetana's medical file was probably stolen by a psychiatrist living in exile in Vienna. However, there is no evidence of this. Smetana's brain was kept in a special glass container by several professors of anatomy until World War II, when the future Plzeň professor of pathology, Dr. Josef Vaněk, preserved it privately to protect it from the Nazis. Professor Hlava had placed the brain in a preservative solution and a glass container, with the hope that when science advanced, it might be possible to study the morphological correlates of Smetana's genius. Although that never happened, after the war, the brain was passed on to neurohistologist Dr. Vladimír Haškovič. However, Vladimír Haškovič was arrested by the communist secret police during political trials, and all his possessions, including Smetana's brain, were confiscated. That is the last trace, which then disappeared. Vladimír Haškovič was arrested, sentenced, and, if I remember correctly, served 3 years in prison. Afterward, he was sent into obscurity, only to briefly become our colleague at the Psychiatric Research Institute in the late 1960s, though that didn't last long. I believe he died in the early 1970s. He fell out of favor because, as a young enthusiastic communist, he had been sought out by the wife of the then communist president Marta Gottwald as the personal doctor of Klement Gottwald. Incidentally, Klement Gottwald suffered from the same disease as Bedřich Smetana and died from it. Thus, colleagues who were initially envious of Haškovič for being able to treat President Gottwald were later glad that the responsibility had not fallen on them, as all the blame for Gottwald's poor care was placed on Haškovič. He was arrested, interrogated by the STB, the secret police, and eventually imprisoned. The most suspicious facts pointing to progressive paralysis were atrophia cerebri rubra. In 1922, the German doctor Hugo Spatz described iron pigment in the cerebral cortex, which confirms the diagnosis of progressive paralysis. Leptomeningitis, arachnoiditis chronica, as described by the French doctor Antoine Laurent Jessebel in his dissertation Recherches sur les maladies mentales on November 21st, 1822, in 6 patients from Charenton with progressive paralysis. The connection between syphilis and progressive paralysis was discovered by Jean-Alfred Fournier in 1879. Smetana's doctors and those who performed the autopsy might not have known about this just a few years later. It wasn't until 1904 that Niesel developed a method to stain the brain for progressive paralysis. And only in 1913 did Hideo Noguchi find the spirochete Treponema pallidum in the brains of patients with progressive paralysis, definitively confirming the link between treponema infection, syphilis, and progressive paralysis. Then there was furunculosis, a predisposition to progressive paralysis, described by the Czech psychiatrist Professor Josef Mysliveček in his 1959 textbook. Hypomania, creativity, productivity. Smetana composed his best works when he was seriously ill, where this hypomania seemed to fuel his energy despite the disease. Ataxia, the frequent staggering and falling that was reported. Hypersensitivity to cold. That's why I pointed out that he had a fur coat in his studio. Possible signs of mercury intoxication. High mercury concentrations were found during the exhumation. Positive serology. During the exhumation, samples taken from the eye socket, nasal cavity, facial bones, mummified soft tissues, skull contents, and both sides of the pelvis yielded the following results. Treponema pallidum hemagglutination test showed a single positive cross. IgG antibodies were present, albeit fluctuating, while the rapid reagent test was positive with 3 crosses in all areas. It's true that all of this is non-specific, but when we look at it together, each symptom might not mean much on its own, yet together they form pieces of a mosaic that clearly points to a diagnosis of progressive paralysis. And anyone who claims otherwise today is bordering on delusion. So to summarize, Bedřich Smetana was a musical genius, one of the greatest composers of the 19th century. For his piano virtuosity, he was sometimes referred to as the Czech Liszt. By the way, they were in contact, and Liszt highly valued Smetana's piano trio in G minor. Many symptoms of his chronic and devastating illness suggest a diagnosis of progressive paralysis as a consequence of untreated, with a question mark because of the suspicious Schmierkur, the mercury ointment. Syphilis, which he likely contracted around 1874 at the latest. However, direct evidence of primary infection is lacking. Nevertheless, the diagnosis is also supported by the autopsy and positive serological tests, which remain conclusive even after 100 years. Smetana died after months of suffering and starvation, a few days after being admitted to the hospital, in painful confusion caused by psychotic symptoms, restlessness, disorientation, incontinence, and loss of self-control. Regardless of the emotionally nationalistic disputes about the nature of his illness, the diagnosis of syphilis never diminished his merits or his place in history. His illness does not diminish his legacy or reputation as one of the most significant composers and the founder of Czech national music. And what you will now hear is one of Smetana's Czech dances, titled Medvěd, the bear, which Smetana composed completely deaf. At that time, he couldn't hear a thing. So imagine this piece written by someone who could hear not a single note, and it was born only in his mind. This also speaks to Smetana's sense of humor, as the lyrics of the song that gave rise to this dance, Medvěd, are, "I won't take you, my dear, for you resemble a bear." So to recap, So to recap, from 1882 onwards, he repeatedly and convincingly described non-existent people in his room and exhibited psychotic symptoms. On May 12, 1884, he died after weeks of starvation and personal humiliation in a psychiatric institution. He is buried at Vyšehrad, where an annual memorial service is held at his grave on the occasion of the opening of the Prague Spring Festival. Thank you for your attention.